So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting and study session of the Santa Clara City Council. I'd like to call this meeting to order. I invite you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance and remain standing for our statement of values. So if you'd please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As we gather, we humbly seek blessings upon this meeting. May we act with strength, courage, and will to perform our obligations and duties to our people with justice to all. Let us seek wisdom so that we may act in the best interest of our people, our neighbors, and our country. All this we ask so we may serve our community with fairness and respect, putting their needs before all.
Thank you. Please be seated. Roll call, Assistant City Clerk.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
Present.
Councilmember Shahal.
Present.
Councilmember Hardy.
Present.
Councilmember Park.
Here.
Councilmember Jane.
Here.
Vice Mayor Cox.
Here.
Mayor Gilmore.
Here.
Statement of Behavioral Standards. The City of Santa Clara has adopted a code of ethics and values and behavioral standards for public meetings to promote and maintain the highest levels of conduct. This includes mutual respect, robust discussion, and allowing city business to be done in an efficient and consistent manner. Please note that, as the presiding officer, the mayor's direction in matters of process and decorum should be followed. Welcome and thank you for your participation. Lobbyists speaking in a lobbying capacity are required to identify themselves as such and disclose the clients and/or organizations that he or she represents at any meeting held with city officials or at public meetings, pursuant to City Code Section 2.155.110.
Thank you so much, Assistant City Clerk. Thank you, Santa Clara community members, real estate and development professionals, all of you that are here. Thank you for gathering here at our Santa Clara Convention Center Theater for tonight's special study session on the state of real estate and the development market in the city of Santa Clara. We have a unique agenda tonight led by a presentation from the Urban Land Institute, who will share economic trends which are affecting development opportunities at the national and most importantly at our local level. ULI will also provide an overview of how development projects are financed. We are a city that has been growing, adding housing and jobs, and we have planned for growth in our specific areas and precise plan in our special project areas. The purpose of tonight is to better understand the complex economic factors that will affect how those and other projects are brought to fruition. I'd like now to introduce our city manager, Jovan Grogan, who will share the agenda for tonight and introduce the topic. City manager.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Gilmore, members of the council, and members of the public here. Again, Jovan Grogan, and I have the pleasure of being the city manager of Santa Clara. First, I want to thank you for attending this special meeting in our Elizabeth Haynes Theater at our very own convention center. I'm really excited to see everyone here today, and the fact that you all came out on a rainy night really speaks volumes to how important this topic is. We've envisioned tonight really as a conversation with professionals in the real estate and development market to better understand the dynamics that impact Santa Clara. In some respects, the current real estate economy is embodying that statement that many things can be true all at the same time. We know that our staff is frankly as busy as ever with permits coming in and meetings with developers saying more is on the horizon. At the same time, we know that some of the highly anticipated projects in our city are stalled. And then also at the same time, we see cranes up and we see projects completing and several thousand units actually opening just in the last few months. And so we want to take tonight to really have a conversation led by the Urban Land Institute, commonly referred to as ULI, so that they can provide information on the realities of real estate and really what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about our agenda. So we are doing things a little different tonight. We're in a different setting. And so one of the things we're going to do is we want to begin with public comment, really to start off today's conversation. And so if you have a question or a comment or a thought, a concern about development in Santa Clara, we want to invite you to come and share that at the beginning of the meeting, and the mayor and our deputy city clerk will preside over that public comment period. We've allocated 30 minutes for the public comment period, and assuming no more than 10 people rush the stage, we'll have three minutes apiece, but the mayor will, as she does always, navigate so that we can stay on time. After public comment, we will take a 5-minute break so that we can transition the stage, and ULI will come up to the stage, and our council members will sit in the front row of the theater today. We've allocated a total of 90 minutes for the ULI presentation, and we have 3 distinguished members of ULI here tonight. We have Libby Seifel, president and founder of Seifel Consulting, which is an economic consulting firm that really specializes in advising public and private clients on planning, funding, and development of high-quality infill development. Infill development, really what we see here in Santa Clara at some of our vacant sites. We also have Eric Tao, managing partner of L37, a Bay Area real estate firm that focuses on development, investment, and advisory services. And we have Drew Hudasik, the Chief Investment Officer of Saris Regis. Saris Regis, you should know, is a real estate development, investment, and management firm that specializes in multifamily residential, commercial, and industrial properties across the western United States. We'll then take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back from that 10-minute break, we will begin with questions from the City Council, and then all of you should have received note cards when you walked in today. So if you didn't receive a note card, put your hand up at any moment, and someone will bring you a note card. What we want you to do with those note cards, if something really strikes you during the presentation, or you have a question, write it down, staff, and then raise your hand. Staff will come and collect that note card. And then during the question and answer section tonight, our very own Economic Development and Sustainability Director, Rena Brio, will read off those questions to our ULI presenters, and we will aim to get to as many of those questions as possible. And so then after that, we will adjourn. Sometimes our meetings go late, but we want to stop at least by 9 o'clock, and we have instructed our convention staff to come in and say, you don't have to go home, but you have to go somewhere. But we also are planning a little networking shortly after the presentation. A little housekeeping items you all may have passed. There's a water station in the back with light refreshments just outside the main doors to the theater. So let me give a few introductory remarks, really just to set the tone for tonight. We all know our council members, our lovely council members are sitting there, but we have Kelly Cox from District 6, Albert Gonzalez from District 1, Raj Jahal representing District 2, Karen Hardy, District 3, Kevin Park, District 4, Suds Jane, District 5, and of course, our mayor. We have 2 appointed officers here, myself, as well as Glenn Googans, our city attorney. Next, we wanted to point out, we have a number of members of our city development team within the audience. And so as many of you know, development is not done by one arm of the city. It is truly an interdisciplinary effort undertaken by members of various departments, from our planning department, our public works department, our power utility, Silicon Valley Power. And so I just want to ask all the city staff members represented on this slide and in the audience, if you can stand and just wave. One of the things that we are here for is they are here to be a part of the presentation, but they are also here to network with you. And so at the break, if you have a question, feel free to grab any of us. Quick snapshot of the city. We're a city of 131 residents. 45% of our residents are foreign-born. The median age of our city is 34. We have 6 council districts, and approximately 4,700 businesses within our community. As a city, we really operate 5 lines of business. There's really everything we do as a city. We are a full service agency, so police, fire, water, stormwater, library, HR, everything that you typically think of a city. Santa Clara is truly a full service city with 1,500 employees. We also have the benefit of running our own electric utility in Silicon Valley Power. The city also operates the Stadium Authority. The Stadium Authority is a separate municipal corporation that the city council sits as the board of, and so that is a public entity. We also own this very beautiful convention center, and we co-operate a regional wastewater facility with the city of San Jose. So truly a full service agency. In our city, many of you know this, we have some of the best companies, frankly, in the world here with Intel, NVIDIA, AMD. We really, truly embody the city's mission, which is the center of what's possible. And Santa Clara University, I can't leave that out. Now let's talk a little bit about development within the city. So as the mayor said, our city is growing. We have just over 7,200 housing units under review or under construction. 4.6 million square feet of non-residential projects under review or under construction. That includes office buildings, data centers, commercial, and industrial. And since 2023, 100% affordable projects have opened in this city, and 1 is under construction, but for a total of just over 1,000 units. And so we are a city that develops housing. We are a city that develops affordable housing, which is not something you can say for all of our counterparts across the Bay Area. Planned growth areas. We have several planned growth areas across the city. So we have over 20,000 units that are planned. And one of the things we'll talk about is this is a city that really takes time to re-envision the future of Santa Clara through long-range studies. And so we have several adopted plans that you can see on this map. On the map, you'll see our adopted plans in green. These include Lawrence Station, Patrick Henry Drive, our downtown precise plan, and the newly approved Kylie Mission Point project. There are also a number of these adopted plans that are currently undergoing study to be amended. That's our Tasman East specific plan, that is related Santa Clara, as well as our Freedom Circle development, and we'll touch on these a little bit later. And then the plans that are shown in yellow are actually under development, actively under development, a El Camino Real specific plan and a Santa Clara Station area plan, really for the terminus of BART is planned to be in Santa Clara, and the city is undertaking an effort to really think proactively about what does that mean and how do we redevelop that entire area. And so there's a specific plan going on for that. Now let's talk a little bit about multifamily construction. And really it's been a banner year for us. There are 2,800 multifamily units under construction, a little over 1,100 of which have recently been completed or will be completed early in the first quarter of 2025. But we all know this development has taken many years to really come to fruition. Many of these projects were first approved in 2019 or 2020, and the reality is the thought and the vision for those projects began many, many years prior, right? Oftentimes with the long-range plan, but really the marriage of a property owner and a developer coming together. And so we know that development and re-envisioning our urban environments is really a long-term process. Data centers, always important to note here. We have the great benefit of being the West Coast capital of data centers. This city, construction really began in earnest in the 1990s, but we have 58 data centers either operating or recently constructed in the city. An amazing asset for, frankly, the world. Because we really help to power the internet across the world. And it's an amazing financial asset for this city. We're at a point, though, where we have limited capacity for growth, both in terms of space and in terms of electricity. And the council knows that we have planned conversations around the future of data centers, as well as our ability to bring in more transmission to the city. What's also true is the residential market, the non-residential market has started to slow. And this chart shows the trend from 23 to 24. And so what we know about Santa Clara is the Santa Clara market is a little different, right? We are sometimes insulated because of the type of companies we have here with our growth and development. But increasingly, we are starting to, as even though we are insulated, the trends of the downturn that was being seen more regionally and nationally to affect our local economy. And so, as you see, new construction per square footage down significantly from 2023 to 2024, and total tenant improvements down over 750,000 square feet. And really, in one of my last slide, we just wanted to take a moment to talk about development and the economic conditions in Santa Clara. While we do have several approved plans and projects that have been entitled, the reality is the market is shifting under us. Despite we having 7 large areas that have undergone specific plans, the reality is that we have only seen construction on 2 of those, Lawrence Station and Tasman East. Additionally, while we have 7 high-rise buildings under construction in Tasman East, that constitutes only half of the units that have been planned for that area, and the other half of the projects are on hold, waiting additional funding. We are partners with Related Santa Clara through a lease agreement to develop an amazing project, really frankly, the largest proposed single development west of the Mississippi. It's a 9.2 million square foot project. However, that project has been stalled due both to funding and finding tenants to occupy the envisioned space, and Related currently is undergoing an amendment process with the city, looking to convert a portion of the property to light industrial that was initially developed or envisioned for an office campus. And so staff is currently reviewing that, and that will come before the appropriate body soon. Our Patrick Henry Drive specific plan, really 12,000 units of capacity there. But in that project, we have seen only 2 projects that have submitted for a planning approval. And of those, one of them, the developer last year backed out, citing market conditions. And so that specific plan area is not moving forward at this time. And so that's part of the reason why we want to have this conversation and really invite ULI to provide insight in what's going on in the regional development economy, but also what's happening here in Santa Clara. And I see a number of members of our downtown task force in the audience. And so Santa Clara really has a mission to restore our historic downtown. And the city really recently underwent a downtown precise plan process that included a form-based code, and that was adopted by council in December of 2024, just last year. And so we want all of the conversations that we're having tonight and additional community engagement to inform how we proceed to realize the vision of that downtown precise plan. So with that, I will turn this meeting back over to the mayor, who will address public comment. We do have 2 mics at the front of the room, and so if again, at the beginning of this, if you came here for a reason, you have a question about development in Santa Clara, or something that you would like the presenters to address during their presentation, don't be shy. Raise your hand during public comment. Actually, come down to the mic, and if you cannot come down to the mic, raise your hand and staff will bring a mic to you. With that, thank you.
Thank you, City Manager, for that report. Gives us a nice snapshot of what's going on in Santa Clara. Before we go to public comment, we have our Police Chief, Corey Morgan, here that would like to just make a few comments. So if someone could give him a microphone so he can address us.
I'll use this one here. Thank you,
Yeah,
Mayor
that's
Chief
fine.
Morgan.
Very good.
First, I thought I'd offer an explanation why I'm sitting off on the side like an abandoned child. I literally can't fit in the seats with my gear on, which I think is a perfect lead into why I'm here, is to just gently remind the council to consider the police department in any development that we undertake in the city. As a reminder, and a lot of you heard me say this during my campaign, we have fewer cops now than we did in the 1980s. There's obviously been significant growth since then. As these county mandated builds come into play, they sometimes tax our resources and the city services. I do want to highlight one example from a Santa Clara development that was completed in November of 2021. I won't call out the specific.
Don't name it,
Yeah,
Chief Morgan.
I won't call out the specific development, but it was completed in November 2021. And in the 3 years prior to it being built, we had 8 police calls for service in the area. In the 3 years since it's been developed, we've had 858 calls for service in that area that have required 688 police hours on scene at that development to handle those calls for service. And that doesn't even account for our detective bureau follow-up time, obviously a considerable draw on our resources, which is fine. We'll happily do it. Just remember that development does bring a resource draw to the police department. So I bring that up not to dissuade development in any way. Just please keep in mind that as the city grows, the police department should grow along with it, and we will continue to provide that first-rate service that the Santa Clara Police Department is known for. Thanks for your consideration tonight.
Thank you, Chief Morgan. Many people don't think about those things, but when we add more people, it's not just the police department, but that's important. It's fire, library, parks, everything. So it's full service. We're a full service city. So thank you so much. So as City Manager Grogan has shared, we will use the public comment now to invite the audience to ask questions or give us comments for the ULI presenters to consider, which they may answer either during their presentation or after the presentation. And our audience members that wish to speak can come to the front of the theater. We have 2 microphones on each side, where you will be able to speak and ask a question or make a comment. So each member, depending on timing, we have about 30 minutes for this, will be limited to 3 minutes. And I might have to adjust it if we have more than 10. I don't see you all rushing forward so much, but we'll see about that. So you can submit any written questions on the note cards as provided, and we'll collect those towards the end of the ULI presentation, so we can make sure that, time permitting, all those questions can be answered. So I'm going to ask our Assistant City Clerk to help facilitate the public comment, and we'll get started. So yes, please, come forward in the microphone.
I'm not bashful, so I thought I would kick things off.
I saw that, yeah.
Help other folks feel comfy coming forward. My name is Alex Shore. I'm with the nonprofit organization Catalyze Silicon Valley. Our members are really excited about a new form of construction called mass timber. We're seeing projects proposed in Mountain View and Palo Alto. I've personally toured one in Oakland that's 19 stories. So would love it if ULI could talk a little bit about the prospects of mass timber, their environmental benefits, their cost and time benefits, and how those could benefit projects in Santa Clara to move faster, be quicker, more environmentally sustainable, and go higher in density and build more homes. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate that. Please come forward. Welcome.
Thank you. Steve Edwards with Ensemble Investments. We just got our temporary certificate of occupancy on 311 units in the Tasman East District. And as we have discussions tonight, I think it's a great forum to be collaborative. This project would not have happened if we weren't collaborative from the beginning. I started on the project in 2013, and now we're just opening. So it is a long time to get this done. It is immensely difficult. We have to get city approvals, then we have to get permitting, then we have to get financing, which is extremely hard. So any way we can work together and be partners is a great thing. So I applaud you for doing this. I'm looking forward to a good discussion.
Thank you, Steve. Anyone else? please come forward. Anyone? There you go.
Skip Pearson with Reclaiming. I've said this before, but I'm interested, and the reason why I came tonight was to see if there's any movement for doing something with the 10 acres that City Hall sits on. It's been sitting there for decades. City Hall is on just the northern 2 acres of it. 8 acres has just been sitting there for decades. Just like downtown, Santa Clara, for the most part, has been sitting for 40, 50 years, 55 years as a parking lot. So I'm very interested in knowing if the city is planning anything or getting any kind of estimates on the development of that 8 acres next to the existing City Hall on Warburton.
Thank you, Skip. Anyone else up here? Rena, no? Okay. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. You can write down your comments and questions as well. Rena, do we have any? Okay. Something, do I need to look now? Okay, okay, very good. Just like a council meeting, thank you. Just go with the flow. All right. I don't see any other public comments, so we are now going to take a 5-minute break to transition to the ULI presentation. So just bear with us. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for having us as representatives of the Urban Land Institute. So Eric, Libby, and myself, obviously, are going to do a lot of talking over the next 90 minutes. But the Urban Land Institute, first and foremost, is a global organization, and it breaks down into a national organization, the U.S., and then the ULI district councils are regional, and the Bay Area is one of the most robust councils in the entirety of ULI. We are all volunteers, if that's not clear. So each of the three of us have day jobs. Our involvement in ULI is volunteer. We come together at ULI as developers, investors, consultants, public officials, public employees, service providers like architects and engineers, and it's really an academic organization that thinks about land use going forward. And ULI does not lobby. It brings people together for discourse, and sometimes cities invite us in for study sessions like tonight. Sometimes they invite us in for other things. But we do not lobby for any particular purpose other than the responsible use of land. The mission statement is up there. Again, we provide a forum. We create opportunities for people to debate back and forth, and we're ultimately trying to find what we think is the best solution and the truth. About our membership, about 30% professional services, 27% financial, developers, public, and others. Pass it off.
Thanks, Drew. So, as Drew said, we're all volunteers, and I guess we just geek out and love real estate. So, beyond doing presentations like this, the city council, cities, and other groups hire us to do technical assistance panels where it's more focused on a specific, maybe, what are we going to, we were in San Jose, so what are we going to do with our strip malls? They're being abandoned, how can we focus on those? We did a downtown San Francisco revitalization. That one, we even do called advisory services panels where we bring ULI members from New York, Detroit, New Orleans, all over the country to come and try to help solve big problems. Urban plan for communities and urban plan for schools. We help train and expose people to the basics of land use in a really fun, Lego involved exercise where we try to plan a community. Development fundamentals, we're going to talk about that some today, and other housing opportunity consultants for one-on-one test fits for different projects.
Right, and I'm Libby Seifel, and I'm really, really glad to be here with all of you. I am a consultant, as the city manager said. I work for a lot of cities like Santa Clara throughout Silicon Valley and also in San Francisco and the broader Bay Area. I work particularly on public-private partnerships when the public and the private sector come together, and we'll be talking about some of that later today. And I'm a real estate economist, so I'm the number cruncher. I work in those, the back room, trying to figure out how to make these deals pencil, which we'll hear a lot about today. And I'm also really excited to say that I was the co-chair with Eric Tao for many years, and we started something called the Housing the Bay program for ULI, and we have our 8th annual Housing the Bay Summit coming up on April 29th in the afternoon. And this is a forum where we invite everyone in this room and everyone across the Bay Area to engage in how can we improve housing for the Bay Area. So please mark it on your calendars. We hope many of you will be able to join us there in our lively discussions about housing.
Thanks. And I'm Eric Tao. I'm a real estate developer. I focus on multifamily housing. My firm is based in San Francisco. Most of my projects are in San Francisco, and just want to say, based on the earlier presentation, your city's doing a lot better than our city right now, so good job.
All right, and I'm obviously Drew Hudasik with Saris Regis. My day job is a developer, investor, and property management firm, pretty much between San Francisco and San Jose and through the East Bay. Personally, I live now in Palo Alto, met my wife in San Francisco many years ago, and if you talk to me for any length of time, you'll know I have 2 daughters. They are both out of the nest, and so I'm a recently minted empty nester. Okay, we're gonna skip to the agenda for tonight, because this is gonna go backwards. After we say thank you to the mayor, members of the council, city staff, and the public for having us. We are honored to be here. We hope you learned something tonight. We've tried to tailor the material so that we're broad brushing a lot of concepts when we basically got asked, can you teach real estate finance, in an hour and a half? And you can't, but you can touch a lot of topics. And your elected officials are not tasked with knowing all of the detail of real estate finance. The task is when the experts bring forward information, do we all know enough to make intelligent decisions? So tonight, hopefully, gives you some information to help you on that path to making good decisions. First, we're going to hit on basically 5 big chapters: real estate trends and outlooks. And that is, broad brush, all the different food groups, what's happening in those food groups, a little bit nationally, and then hopefully bring it down to Santa Clara. We heard questions about mass timber. We heard questions about the City Hall site, which may be a little too specific for this group. And obviously, you heard from another developer how difficult the process can be. We're going to touch on those things. Capital, that's money. Chapter 2, how does capital look at risk and return with respect to real estate and all of their other options? So we'll touch on that. Chapter 3, you often hear people say a deal pencils or it doesn't pencil. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of things don't pencil, and we'll try to illustrate why that is. For many, many people, the number one piece of real estate that they know, love, and touch is their house. And so a lot of times when we bump into people in grocery stores, they say, well, my house is going up in value, isn't it? So isn't real estate doing great? Tonight, we're going to talk about housing, but we'll also illustrate why so many other parts of real estate, even though they may appear to be doing well on the surface, the values underneath are changing. Land residual, if you are a landowner in Santa Clara and you're interested in selling your land to somebody who's going to develop it, sometimes that land can drastically change up and down in value in a very short amount of time, and we'll touch on why that is. And then finally, in the last bit of the presentation, hopefully we'll help the policymakers and members of the public understand what can you all do to help spur the development that you may want to see.
So before we get started, what we're not good at is technology. I think I have an old version up, so if you bear with me, I'm going to put up the more recent version. Thank you, appreciate it.
So we're actually going to start with the money, because without the money, you can't do real estate, and you need a lot of money to do real estate development in the Bay Area, because our construction costs are high, the rest of our development costs are high, it takes a long time to do development. So that's why you're going to hear these scary numbers like it costs $1 million a unit to build or $800,000 a unit to build housing, depending on what you're building. So that's why we wanted to start with the money side.
Yeah, a lot of people. So I hope you're not more confused about real estate risk, return, and value after this presentation than you started, so I'll do my best. Everyone asks me, I do housing development. The same refrain. There's not enough housing in the Bay Area. It's undersupplied. There's a crisis. It's huge demand for housing. Why aren't you building more housing, Eric? Isn't that the simple law of supply and demand? If there's more demand for housing, don't we provide supply? Isn't that the simple law of economics? Unfortunately, I want to build more housing. We all want to build more housing, but money is impartial. Money is efficient. It just looks for the highest returns for the lowest risk. So what does that mean? And hope to try to explain that. The universal truth is investment, capital, money, again, being impartial, they'll look for the highest return for the lowest risks. And if the low risk returns are paying more than the higher risk returns, you're not going to let money flow into the higher risk categories.
It's
This thing
jumpy.
is very sensitive. So how do we create value for people to take risks in a real estate venture? Existing value, and Drew's going to explain more about this in detail, but just to illustrate, the bar needs to be tall enough. That's the simplest way I can say it. It has to have value. It has to have both your profit, the costs, and the land, let's call it the dirt, all encapsulated in one asset in order for someone to take the risk to invest. What's happened recently? First of all, show of hands, how many people have heard the term cap rate? Everybody. How many people understand what cap rates are? Okay, that's pretty good, because you ask 5 different real estate developers and economists, in fact, the 3 right here, we will argue and differentiate on what a cap rate is. So I'm not going to try to become the ultimate arbiter of what cap rate is defined as. I'm going to take it a very simple way of looking at it. Any asset right here with $100 return on investment, you put something in, you get $100 back. Is that as your profit? Treasuries. There are almost a 20-year high right now. They're generating 4%. That means for a $2,500 investment, you're getting 4% on it. It's much safer than real estate. What does that do? It makes real estate need a higher return because it's less safe than treasuries. So real estate, they're saying, hey, for that same $100, I want 6% return for a multifamily, for a housing project. What does that mean? It means that it pushes down the value. For the same $100, to get 6%, the value goes down. Remember that bar we looked at earlier? That bar, which included costs, land, and profit, it gets squeezed down because it has to return a higher cap rate. Office is even a higher risk product. So it wants an 8% return. So that's even more difficult to finance now because the 8% is squeezing down the value for the same $100, assuming that's the amount of return you're having. High returns on low-risk investments like T-bills cause values for real estate to go down, or lower risk, higher returns on low risk cause real estate values to go down. See, I get confused myself. So what was it like in 2019? In 2019, T-bills are only paying 2%. And so they only wanted a 4% to 5% return on multifamily. It boosted the values up. You could pay a lot more for an apartment building with the same $100 and get the 4 to 5% return. So we were building a lot of housing back then. And a lot of things that are driving T-bills and everything are interest rates, et cetera. In today's environment, with a higher interest rate, it's driving up T-bills and making the values not as much lower because they're demanding a higher return, a higher cap rate. Again, these cap rates, the higher and higher demand, cap rates because of the higher and higher risk. And that's why money is impartial. They don't care. They say, for that risk, I want this return, and that pushes down values if the returns go higher.
If I could just interject, when we say money is impartial, a lot of times we hear communities in the Bay Area say, we know there's a housing problem. Why don't people want to invest here? They know if you build housing in the Bay Area, you know it's going to get filled. The thing is, Eric, myself, we're developers that live, eat, and breathe in the Bay Area, and this is our home turf. The money that comes into projects in the Bay Area can come from San Francisco just as easily as it can come from Chicago, New York, London, or Hong Kong. So people who are halfway around the world, they are just simply looking for a financial return. And if we can present them an opportunity and convince them it's the best return for their money, housing will get built here. If they've got a project somewhere else or an equity investment or stock market investment somewhere else, the money goes somewhere else.
So why, then you want to ask, well, you're always going to fill your housing. You're always going to get people to live in your apartments. Why is it a higher risk? Well, because of these things. These are the elements that go into new development. I think East Tasman, a developer said it took him 10 years to get his project. 2013 till now. There's entitlement risk, environmental risk, construction, financing, market, insurance, political, NIMBYs versus YIMBYs, et cetera. These are all the risks that when you buy a T-bill, you don't have any of these. This is what makes money more expensive for housing, despite the fact, again, as Drew said, you'll always be able to fill your apartment buildings. Before we get to trends and outlook, I do want to make one last statement. This 6%, this is what the market's demanding today. Do I agree that 6% is a required return for housing in the Bay Area? I don't. Especially if you work with good developers like me and Drew, there's almost no risk. But that's something we can all do. We can change the way Wall Street, we can try to influence and change the way Wall Street and the people who manage money look at housing risk. And we'll get into that later. And that will make housing development more a likely place for money to flow. So thank you.
So, go ahead.
Okay, we're going to talk about some of the trends right now. So first we'll look at pre-pandemic, what was going on before 2020. Looks like most of you, raise your hand if you remember what things were like in 2008, 9, and 10, the great financial crisis, okay? So in the real estate world these days, we think of the GFC to the pandemic was kind of a golden era. Why? Well, interest rates were at all-time lows. And when I say all-time lows, money was effectively free, right? The Fed rate was as close to zero as it could be. Similar to today, occupancy in apartments was good, great. Rents were great. But when you have occupancy high, rental rates high, and money is free, then it really has a very low risk profile, and the values of apartment buildings and really all real estate were at all-time highs. So any real estate that produces income, which is almost anything we're going to talk about tonight other than for sale housing, which we will also touch on, cap rates are low, values are high. That's what was happening when the pandemic hit. Since the pandemic, there are some uncertainties about interest rates, but there are other things that we didn't even know could be uncertainties, like hybrid work. All of a sudden, you could live in Boise, Idaho, and have a job in Santa Clara, California, because you never had to come to the office, right? It's arguable today when many, many corporations are saying that they're demanding people to be back in the office, but most big corporations, and there was an article written in the Business Journal recently, they had 8 big companies, including many of the ones that were on the Santa Clara slide, the NVIDIAs, the AMDs, the Applied Materials. They are allowing hybrid work, or they're not enforcing people to be in the office 5 days a week. And what businesses should do is a whole different conversation, but that affects the housing market, because even if people have to live, have to work 2 or 3 days a week in the office, they can live much further away, which is a good thing and a bad thing. In the office sector, if people maybe need to be in the office or maybe they don't, or if they have unassigned desks and different workstations, then companies may not need as much physical office space. And so that's why a lot of the office space around Santa Clara and the Valley in general, the parking lots are relatively empty, particularly Mondays and Fridays. So the demand side is really kind of turned upside down. If you have a great apartment building today, its value is down 15 to 30% from what it was in 2018 or 19. If you have an office building today, depending on where it is and how full it is, its value is probably down 30 to 70% from 2018-19. And in 2022, interest rates really started to ramp up, and then that changed the economic game that Eric was touching on. So here we go. Apartments are down 15 to 30%, office is down 30 to 70%.
So to add on the money side and what Eric talked about earlier is that many people are not aware that a lot of the investment that goes into real estate is institutional investors. Those are people that, if you have a pension, your pension fund is being managed by managers, and they have to think about how are they going to invest these assets that their pensioners have been contributing. CalPERS, for example, the state of California's pension retirement system, invests quite a bit in real estate. They have to make a decision. How much do we invest in real estate? How much do we invest in other kinds of investments, like stocks or bonds? If a pension fund experiences a lot of losses in real estate, which can be book losses, by which I mean is just building on what Eric said, if you thought your value was here and cap rates go up, what happens to values? As cap rates go up, values go down, right? So when the institutional investment market sees this occurring, it gets skittish. For a while, we were the darling. The gateway cities were the darling of investment. San Francisco, Silicon Valley, that's where everyone wanted to invest, was the gateway cities. As time has gone on, and that includes Seattle, that includes Boston, New York City, et cetera. But as time goes on, other areas that have been more competitive from a cost standpoint and a labor standpoint have gotten even more competitive. The Sunbelt cities, Texas, which we're constantly compared to as well. So what happens is that there's kind of a lemmings effect too. If one major institutional investor decides that they're going to get out of real estate or they're going to significantly lower their real estate portfolio, it can sometimes have an industry-wide impact. Along with that is if you're a pension fund, I'm going to just stay with pension fund, because if you have your pension, you want to make sure it's invested wisely, right? You don't want them to make a mistake. You don't want to be a bankrupt pension fund, right? So keeping that in mind, so traditionally, the safest real estate investment has been industrial, which you have a lot of and are blessed at being one of the original industrial centers of Silicon Valley and the world, really. So industrial is less expensive to build. It can be built up quicker. Typical industrial, meaning like the 1 to 2 story industrial that you've seen, the traditional investment. And the rents are very low, but it was very reliable for there to be a constant income stream. Secondly, is we all need to live somewhere. So multifamily housing is the next one on the chain. Retail was considered to be the third least risky development. Now that's changed. Why has that changed? Amazon, internet shopping, the way we shop as a group. COVID changed our shopping patterns, right? So just like hybrid work, it affected things. Drew talked about office, right? At certain points, office is the favorite child of investors. But right now, no, not at all, because as he's pointed out, values have really tanked. Hospitality, like this whole complex here, is usually the most risky. So if it's the most risky real estate, where do you think cap rates are on this scale with hospitality? Are cap rates higher or are they lower? they're higher, right? So it's more difficult. It takes more to get hospitality built. And last, but certainly not least, because a lot of what developers are in is the business of land entitlement or speculation. Without somebody saying what's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years, right? If somebody doesn't have that dream and does those plans like you've all been doing, your precise plans, then they're not going to be able to move forward. So we talked about cap rates, and you can see the relative relationship of apartments, industrial, office, and retail. Now, industrial cap rates have been higher, but that is a function of, like, right now, if you see here, they're the favored, right? So it moves, the marketplace moves. The other thing that Eric pointed out is that treasuries affect this. Oops, sorry, I skipped a slide. This is very important. So as Eric was talking about with multifamily, there's a trend line. It's not a perfect trend line, but it's a trend line that shows you as interest rates start to go down, the market is sticky, so things don't happen right away. There's usually lags, and there are other forces that take into account cap rates other than 10-year treasuries, but they tend to move in cycles. And I have to take a moment to thank Jay Scholl, who's in the audience from CBRE, who provided a lot of this technical market data, and I'm just very grateful to CBRE for doing this. So overall, what's happened here is that cap rates have just spiked, right? So they're much higher than they used to be for multifamily. So what are the investors thinking about? What are the pension funds thinking about? And why does this affect Santa Clara? When I found this slide, I was like, okay, this is the perfect slide I have to show you, because why do people want data centers? Because of what? ChatGPT, for one, AI, right? Industrial manufacturing of all the technology produced in Silicon Valley, it's driven by data. It has to have data centers. There's an energy crisis around data centers, as I heard the city manager talk about earlier. Telecommunications is very favored. Manufactured housing encompasses a whole range of technology products of trying to build housing cheaper, faster, and easier. And you can just sort of see down the line, I'm not going to read this, but what you can see now is you can see the flight away from office, right? The flight away from shopping centers and malls and lodging resorts and apartments, right? So you can see that people change their views. You are blessed by having a very strong industrial market in Silicon Valley. The market is very strong, and yet you have experienced more vacancies lately, and you have also been experiencing a lot of subleasing. So some of the large companies are deciding to sublease space. And we're going to go through these quickly, and then if you have follow-up questions, we can go over that in the Q&A. This is what Drew was talking about, the return to office. The return to office rates for the Bay Area, while good and getting better, they are not comparatively to the rest of the country. So we are just at 21%, like for San Francisco. Though I will say the downtown feels more and more vibrant, but it's still, way down. Oops, sorry. And I think I have one more retail, and then Drew.
No,
you want to add to this?
Interject on office. So I know there was an event a week or two ago. I think Vlad with the registry hosted something in San Francisco, and they had facilities representatives from a few major corporations: the Gap, Genentech, NVIDIA, obviously from Santa Clara, and I think Cloudflare was the fourth. And all of these corporate real estate people said, you know what, our job used to be so easy. The C-suite would tell us how many people they were going to employ or hire, and we just took the number of people times 200 square feet per person, and we knew exactly how much space we needed. Simple math. They said now, Genentech had an example of a building that they designed for 1,300 employees. They currently have 1,700 employees badging into that building every day, and they have capacity for more. And it's a function of how many days a week are people coming in, how many hours a day are they spending there, what kind of hours are they spending there. There's a conference room seat, a couch in the corner, a cafeteria with bench seating, and any one of those places can be considered a workstation, right? It's not the old days where you just had a blend of private offices and cube farms, and it just averaged out to 200 square feet per person. So even the corporations, they don't even know, looking forward, how much space they need, even if they have certainty about the number of employees. And I can guarantee you right now, none of them have certainty about the number of employees. So there are just more and more variables in the equation than probably ever before.
And that's actually true of retail too. Nobody really knows where retail is headed, but we know we are way over retailed in the United States. We have way too much retail. I know that everyone wants retail and a vibrant downtown, a vibrant place to shop, and at the same time, our shopping patterns are not supporting that retail. So one of the things I just wanted to point out in Santa Clara is you have this data is from CoStar, and CoStar has compiled data by 3 different areas: the south, the central, and the north. The southern part of Santa Clara represents over 3/4 of your retail. It has a lot of your major large retail centers in South and power centers, et cetera. The strip centers, which are your older centers along El Camino and other areas in your city, and this is true throughout the Bay Area, so you're not alone, those centers typically have higher vacancy rates, and they also are more vulnerable because if, say, an anchor goes away, like a grocery store or a major hardware store, then they lose their traffic, right? So the vacancy rate is highest in the strip centers, and that is also true in the rest of the marketplace, though because you have over, I think it's a crazy number, it's over 4 million square feet in this market. Your other 2 markets are much smaller comparatively. But you are seeing that strip center vacancies are higher. Why is this important for real estate and for housing is that as centers get more and more vacant, they become opportunities for redevelopment. Or it may be that a developer, a residential developer, for example, that now under state law can redevelop a center, may be able to redevelop that center. But they have to make sure that the center is empty, right, ultimately, in order to build housing. So now I'm going to turn it over to Drew for housing.
Sure. So housing, of course, we know it's in demand, but there are many different types, right? There's single-family homes. There are apartments for rent. How many people here, by show of hands, have heard of single-family rental or build-to-rent? So that is effectively a new asset class that's developed in the last maybe 10 plus years, where institutions are building large communities of single-family homes for the purpose of renting them instead of selling them. Let's see. So this is a slide about Bay Area statistics, but I can tell you again, Santa Clara is not alone. The Bay Area is not alone. Nationally, the United States typically builds about 1.2 million to 1.7 million single-family homes a year, and typically plus or minus 750,000 multifamily units or rental apartments in a given year. The trend is the same, up, 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 until it's not. And the reason is, just like Jovan mentioned about Santa Clara and the number of multifamily units that are under construction or are delivering, you heard one gentleman say his project took, 11 or 12 years to come to fruition. That's a little lengthy, but most development projects are 4 to 7 years from concept to occupancy and stabilization. So the apartments that you're seeing finished today and occupying today, they were dreamed up at a different economic time, in a different economic environment. And they were kicked off and financed in a different economic environment. So there are many, many peers in the industry, like Eric and myself, that had a lot of multifamily deliveries in 2023, 22, 23, maybe 24. And I can guarantee you almost every one of us has many, many fewer apartments delivering in 25, 26, and 27. Because if I didn't start a project in 24, I'm not delivering anything in 26 or 27. And that's the case for most of us. Production is simply down. For sale, I won't ask for the show of hands, but I'll try and read the thought bubbles over your head. In the United States, about 62% of single-family homes have a mortgage. And so there's a good, over a third of people who own their home own it free and clear, no debt whatsoever. But for the 2/3 of us that have a house with a mortgage, think about if you would raise your hand if I asked the question, is your mortgage 3%? Does it have a 3% interest rate or less? Does it have a 4% or less? 5% or less? Well, nationally, roughly 62% of homeowners have a mortgage at 5% or lower. And that was a statistics by John Burns, who's a real estate economist. I Googled it tonight just to fact check that and see what you would find if you're on your phone right now. One stat I saw said 70+% of homeowners have a mortgage rate under 5%. 80+% of mortgage holders have a rate under 6%. So what? Well, the so what is that a new mortgage is 7% or higher. So if you own a home and you have a 4% mortgage and you think to yourself, hey, should I sell this house and go move? And on the next house, I'm going to have a 7 or an 8% mortgage. Almost nobody has an incentive to move. And so that is kind of bogging down the system of resale homes turning over. And so in 2024, the United States had a 30-year low in the number of resale homes sold. That does mean that for new home builders, there's opportunity because there's so little supply. Whether you look at a resale home or a new home, there's so little to buy. So that's one of the reasons that new home sales and new home building is actually robust, even though mortgage rates are up, because effectively they're the only game in town. Okay, now we're going to talk about when does a deal pencil. And these slides are near and dear to my heart. I'm not going to treat you like my kids, but this is how I tried to tell my kids what I do for work. Okay, so we're going to, left side of the screen is, in very, very simple terms, the capital or the money that it takes to build, we'll call it a new multifamily project. So you've got debt, which is effectively a construction loan that you're going to go get from a bank or an institutional lender. And then you've got two pieces of equity. One, the small piece comes from somebody like L37 or Ceres Regis. We in the industry are known as the deal sponsor. I joke that we're the sweat, the hustle, the expertise. We have a little bit of money and hopefully a lot of expertise. We go out and we recruit a big investor. That might be a JP Morgan. It might be a billionaire tech family that's investing in real estate. They have a lot of money. And it's not they have a little bit of expertise, but they have a little bit of attention to pay to real estate. So they're going to trust Eric with a huge chunk of money. And if everything goes well, Eric creates a great project, and now the right side of this screen is the value. The value, if we're in business for a profit, is higher than the cost. The debt is theoretically not at risk. So if you borrow $1, you only have to pay back $1. But if you recruit $1 of equity, that equity is at risk, and if the deal goes up, that equity wins. Whether it comes from the developer, which is typically the general partner, or the investor, which is the limited partner. And I didn't highlight the details, but folks like Eric and I in private companies typically work off of what's called a promote model, which means if we invest $1 in a project, when things go badly, we lose money alongside our investor. When things go well, we get a bigger percentage of the profit than the investment that we made.
These are the good old days.
Yeah, and that's what we get paid for bringing the opportunity and the expertise. However, this is sort of what things feel like today.
Bad old days, bad new days.
I would bet you that most of the apartments that you're seeing that are occupying today are in this situation, if they're lucky. The left side is the cost. The right side is the value. And this little chunk, that difference between the cost and the value, is how much money was lost. I said if you're lucky, because if you're lucky, you can pay back your debt and you've lost some of your equity. This is actually happening in a lot of places. The value has dropped so much that all the equity's wiped out, and now the lender's in trouble.
Like with the office and hotels that you're hearing about in San Francisco.
Absolutely. This, particularly with new office development, and again, Santa Clara is blessed. A company like an NVIDIA, if you paid attention to the news, other than a blip a few weeks ago, they've been on a tear. They may be growing when a Meta or a Google is not, right? But they're the unicorn. They're different. For most office situations, most office developers, they probably kicked off a project 4 or 5 years ago. Most likely that building today is empty, and that building is worth not only less than, it's lost not just the equity invested, but now the bank is figuring out, do I want to foreclose? Do I want to work with the sponsor and try and recut the deal? Do I just want to sell this thing on the open market, cut my losses, and move on?
And I just want to add, again, going back to the cap rates, not only is the income going down, but as we illustrated earlier, cap rates are going up, which is pushing value down because of the overall investment markets.
Okay. So this slide is just one example of the multifamily world, and this is an absolute illustration of why you're not seeing more new apartments start. The left side, I'm going to peg at $650,000 a unit. And of course, if I pay $50,000 a unit for land versus $150,000, and that's about the range that coming out of the GFC, you could buy apartment land, for very little, and $50,000 a door was kind of where things started to move. It went up to $150,000 and it's collapsed back down. Today, because of this dynamic, land that's entitled for apartments is probably worthless. And of course, there are always exceptions. There are uber high net worth families that either have, a multi-generational outlook, or they're building for philanthropic reasons, or they're building a phase of a project that's tied to some other obligation that they can't avoid. But in most cases today, $650,000 a door, $650,000 per unit is a pretty good number for what it takes to create new apartments. And of course, there's always site-specific differences. But the 510 of value, that's a number I took from a brokerage investment book that looked at all of the apartment assets that have sold in the Bay Area in the last 18 months, where the apartments were 2015 vintage or newer. The average sales price was actually $508,000 per unit. So why would I build at $650 a door to lose $142,000 a unit? You wouldn't.
Oh, and then Drew, can we go back to one slide, or yeah, this one. Okay, so back to sort of the institutional markets and the way that people think about money. So if this happens to lenders, right, if they lose money on their debt, what do you think they do to mitigate risk as a lender? So they increase their standards, right? They tighten up their underwriting standards. They say, okay, we really need to understand what the value of this property is, right? So they do that, they scrutinize that. What else do? They say, okay, look, we're not gonna lend this much debt, which is about 60% kind of here. We're only gonna lend 50%. And now you developer, you have to raise 50% of investor equity and developer equity, and you developer have to be on the hook for more, right? And investor equity has to pay a much higher rate of return than debt, right? So you might hear this term about leverage in real estate. So leverage means debt. So as you have less leverage or less debt, it affects the way you look at real estate. And that is going on a lot in the marketplace right now as well. I just wanted to add that before we got to land residual value. So on land residual value, so why is this important? So as Drew said earlier, you have to think about, as a developer, what's it going to be like, let's say 10 years from now. Let's hope it's 5 years from now by the time your project is going to be underway. But you have to assess, what can I afford to pay for land right now today if I want to actually acquire a piece of property, or option a piece of property, which sometimes happens with the property owner. So I have to be thinking ahead, right? So I'm the developer, and I'm thinking, how much can I afford to pay for this piece of dirt, this piece of land? So what I do is I perform a land residual analysis. And what that says is, okay, all of those costs and the value that both Drew and Eric have been going over, I have to make sure that I can pay for that, right? So I have to look at the future value. So I have to decide, as a real estate developer, do I think cap rates for multifamily are going to be at 4%, at 5%, or at 6%? Or what do I think cap rates are going to be 5 to 10 years down the line? Then I have to say, what do I think my project costs are going to be 5 to 10 years down the line? What kind of returns am I going to have to pay to these investors? What kind of risks could happen? Is there going to be another pandemic, right? Heaven forbid. What else is going to happen? Bird flu, that's more likely. So I have to take that into account. So in a simple equation, oops, oh, sorry, I knew that was going to happen. So the land, right? If you look at this as all part of cost, there's land, there's construction costs, hard construction costs, there's soft costs, fees and exactions. You have to pay construction financing. So while you're building a project, you have to go to a bank, you have to borrow money to pay for all these costs. So you have to pay for construction financing. And that financing also has to cover your lease-up period, right? So if you're an apartment, it has to take you through that lease-up period until you can refinance it. And you have to factor in return. So these are very much often fixed costs. And then the variable is this land or residual value. Oops, sorry. This thing is jumpy. So let's just take Drew's example of $650,000 in value. And our project costs are about $500,000 for everything but land, right? And we have to get a return, and that's just got to be a risk-adjusted return because we know it's going to take us a long time to get this to happen. You have to build in some contingency for risk. You have to figure out what kind of investors you're going to attract. So about $100,000 a unit is for your return, and that leaves you with $50,000 per door.
Yep. And actually, we said there was going to be no math, but we lied. So you all remember those numbers from the slide that Libby just presented. So 130 million is the total of this of these bars, and we said 10 of that was the land, right? 130 of which 10 is the land. If times were really good and I thought that I could afford $140 million for this project, how much would I pay for the land? 20, exactly. If I thought this was going to be 120 million because things aren't so good, how much can I pay for the land? 0. Okay, now put yourself in my shoes or Eric's shoes, and you're walking into somebody's office in Santa Clara, and you're saying, I know that a couple months ago, I told you I could pay you $10 million or $20 million for the land. Today, I can pay you 0. You want to sell?
Keep it a parking lot.
So
that's why they stay a parking lot.
So for a lot, for sophisticated institutions that buy and sell, real estate assets all the time, they could give this presentation. For the family whose, grandpa bought land in Silicon Valley and passed it down to the kids, and now the grandkids are trying to monetize it, they look at us like we're crazy. And they say, how could land have been cut in half? Or how could it be cut to 0 in 6 months or a year? Real estate is a forever thing. How can the land be so volatile? And the answer is, I put over here, this is pretty much fixed because, of course, returns change depending on investor appetites. Construction costs move a little. But generally speaking, everything in an apartment deal today is pretty well known by the developers, and the land is the only thing that can move. So when the whole thing moves a little bit, the land value, just spikes like a roller coaster. And it can be maddening because, people like us have to try to explain it every day, and the people on the other side of the table that we're trying to do a transaction with look at us like we're idiots.
And to add to that, if you think about this on a per acre basis, I don't know how many of you watch land values on a per acre basis around Silicon Valley. But when tech companies were out trying to compete, right, to buy land, they were moving up the price of land. Life sciences companies were moving up the price of land. So $10 million an acre, right? If this was 200 units, that's a 200 dwelling unit per acre density, right? So more likely it's 100 dwelling units per acre, which means it's $5 million per acre, which means you're talking about less expensive land. You can't compete with the high-tech companies or the life science companies that can pay a lot more for dirt.
Yep. Okay, how are we doing? We got it? Everything? Totally understand it? All right, so what can we do about it? The reality is there are moments in time when, you know, development is about to launch on the margin and cities can say, hey, let's reduce our park fee, or let's, you know, make some little decisions, sacrifice a few things, and we can spur development. The reality is today, as we sit here in early 2025, it would be very, very difficult for cities to, you know, turn a few of the inputs and all of a sudden see development. That is just where we are today. But the good news is we live in Silicon Valley. That's going to change. It always comes back. It always comes back with a roar. It's never as bad as it seems. And remember, the next time it's really good, it's never as good as it seems either. So there's three things that the cities or the public can try and do. You can try and help lower cost. You can try and help increase revenue. Or what markets hate the most is uncertainty. Just increasing certainty. And that can mean schedules, you know, timeline, process. Anything you can do to increase certainty is helpful. So lowering cost. Planners hate it when I say this, but when we look at land for apartments, the very first thing we do is ask, how many parking spaces do I need to build? And how am I going to build them? And what's that going to cost me? And so even in 2025, when younger people aren't getting their licenses, when everybody has Uber and Lyft and ride shares, parking is still a major, major cost. And it's a dangerous lever to pull because I can point to apartment complexes just north of here and some other towns that with very progressive codes built apartments with very, very low parking counts, and they're having trouble leasing. Because the reality is, at least for now, people do still have cars, they still want parking. Retail in the wrong place. You know, retail works at the ground level in almost every building in Manhattan because you have 100,000 people a day going past every single window, right? In Santa Clara, I know there's questions about your downtown. Even in other areas, the foot traffic and the oftentimes the vehicle traffic is what creates eyeballs, which is what makes retail successful. If you don't have a ton of foot and vehicle traffic, very, very difficult to make retail successful. And as you heard Libby allude to earlier, in retail centers, you often have things like, the word an anchor tenant means a really, really big tenant that's going to bring in all the traffic. Guess what? The anchor tenants pay the least amount of rent per square foot. It's all the little shops next to the anchors that are depending on the anchor tenant to bring in the foot traffic. Those little spaces are the ones that pay the big rents because they're relying on somebody else. Fees, you know, yes, you can lower fees, but again, today it may not be possible to lower them enough. Utility connections, et cetera. Santa Clara is blessed to have your power authority. One of the reasons you have so many data centers and you're so attractive to that market is because of your power authority. Percentage of affordability. This is obviously a very difficult one to talk about because we all have our own view of the need for housing, the need for affordable and attainable housing. Affordable I use as kind of a capital A legal term that's tied to county median income. Attainable housing is kind of a mushier word that's, you know, if market rate housing is too expensive for the average person and affordable housing, quite honestly, is a lot of people make too much money to qualify for affordable. Attainable is that missing middle. You know, what kind of housing is available for folks that can't afford the top end apartment but want to live in Santa Clara. And so affordability, when we looked at that land residual analysis, from a mathematical perspective, so put aside social goals, from a mathematical perspective, affordable housing comes out of the land. It's ultimately, the more affordability in a project, the less value the overall project has to the finance world, and that land piece at the bottom of that graph, the yellow block, gets squished. So that's another lever that cities can pull. Real estate tax reduction, this is a very, very difficult one, certainly in California, but just to make you aware, there are places like New York City where they've said, for building conversions, right? Maybe you've heard of the idea of taking office buildings and converting them so that they can become apartments. In suburban places like Santa Clara, as urban as it may be in some neighborhoods, it's very, very difficult to think about that. New York said, hey, if you take an office building that's empty and convert it to apartments, we will give you a real estate tax abatement for a few decades. And so it's a sacrifice the city's making, but it's revitalizing some urban areas. Construction costs and infrastructure, of course, are a big part. Anything the cities can do to help that would be wonderful. And then sustainability. There are certainly, again, there are goals for sustainability, and then there are goals for housing production, and they're not always in perfect alignment. So sometimes sustainability goals can add cost. They may have great long-term impacts, but if the number one goal is just to get the housing built, those are some things that the cities can consider.
And I'm going to talk about revenues, but just on the cost side, I think just adding to the certainty of what your regulations are and how are they adding cost is another area for just consideration as well. So on the revenue side is, you do this great in Santa Clara, in the city. Just enhancing the local and regional economy is critical. So, there's this old adage, which is retail follows rooftops, right? Without people living there, without people walking by, retail can't survive. But retail is much more complex than that. It also is very dependent on the non-residential uses as well, like office. And those people that are going to go out and buy lunch or buy something while they're at work is really important. So what you do to promote the regional economy is also critical for developing housing, because that actually creates that demand, right? That actually helps with housing. As Drew was talking about, allowing higher incomes for affordable housing, there's some tensions to talk about this more, is that as you get higher up on the income stream, people may or may not want to have to be qualified for affordable housing. So you have to price affordable housing in a way, or rent affordable housing in a way that bears that in mind. But for example, San Francisco has been experimenting with a lot of missing middle of housing in the sort of 100 to 150% of area median income. Reducing transfer taxes. This is true for some cities, may not be as true for Santa Clara, but when developers develop, and this is kind of something also that doesn't get talked about a lot. So when Drew and Eric are doing a development, they have to think about, typically their loan that they're getting, their construction loan, is a 3 to 4 year construction loan. 3 to 5 year construction loan, okay? So as I said, that has to get them through the land development piece, the infrastructure development, the buildings, right? And then it has to get them through lease up. So hopefully they can pull it out in 4 or 5. At that point, they have to refinance. They have to go to permanent financing. If they're really lucky, they found a lender that's doing construction and permanent, but often it's a different lender, right? So at that point, they have to refinance. When they refinance, or they actually sell the property at that point. So the value of the sale at that point is really important. Also, because there's going to be a transaction cost, the higher the transfer taxes there are, the higher the rate, that gets taken out of basically the value, right? So what an investor or what somebody is willing to pay has to take that into account. And then rent control is something that is very important. Rent stabilization is very important in a lot of communities, and it's very important to protect tenants, and we recognize that. It's just that it has to be done in a mindful way. So for example, right now, one of the concerns is that insurance costs have been going up a lot. And so there has to be flexibility for there to be able to be pass-throughs of some of those expenses as well.
Thanks, Libby. The third thing that Drew alluded to about what can we do is increase certainty, and this goes all the way back to the beginning of the presentation. As we said earlier, more certainty, lower risk, lower return requirement. Higher risk, more uncertainty, investors will want to see a higher threshold of return to place their capital. There are certain groups, real estate investors, that will not invest in San Francisco because of the great uncertainty of that city between protests and government, et cetera. So Santa Clara is a pretty good city. It has procedures well outlined. There's not a lot of political drama as in San Francisco, but more can be done. The more certain that, and it's just not administrative process or political process. If, for example, you knew that the reason why people only want a 4% return on a treasury right now versus 6% on housing is because they're certain on the full faith and credit of the US government. Although maybe today that 4% is better placed here. Sorry, I had to throw that in.
We're in California, we can say that.
But no, seriously, this is one of the things that ULI is working on. We're trying to recalibrate the way people look at investment in workforce housing. Investment in housing in cities like Santa Clara, in places like the Bay Area, which is a very, very safe investment. And the idea that it has to be that much more risky and that higher return, again, a Drew slide, pushing down the value to $500 to $10,000 a door to get the 6% return. If we got it to 4% return, because it's as certain as a T-bill, we'd be building housing today because the value would be at $750,000 a door, more than the cost. So leave you with that. Things that we can do: increase revenue, lower cost, and increase certainty for housing production and for office production. And with that, we'll conclude. And
I did want to circle back to some of the questions. I know one of the questions was on mass timber, right? And mass timber, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a building type. It's not using traditional lumber. It's using composite lumber to create these massive pieces of wood and timber, and they go together like Tinker Toys. And you can build taller buildings than you can out of traditional wood framing in a safe way. You can build buildings that have very, very large roof spans, on the interior, kind of like this auditorium. And then depending on how high you go, because you can build high-rise with them, you can actually leave the timber exposed. And so some people would argue that the interior space in mass timber buildings is just so much warmer and so much more welcoming, and it just creates a better building. The good news, bad news is we are in the technology innovation center of the universe, and we are in real estate. And real estate has some people who are the most uncreative people on the face of the planet. And when I say that, what I mean is a lot of real estate folks, when they're looking at new projects, and the bankers and investors, they want comparables, they want data. So they want to look at a building and say, okay, I can understand this building because it's been built 1,000 times before. And I have all these examples of what it's going to cost, how it's going to act over time, what it's going to cost to run this building for 10 or 30 or 50 years. And anytime you get a new building technology, and mass timber qualifies as a relatively new technology, there are always people who are skittish about it. So, we joke internally, there's a difference between being on the bleeding edge and being on the leading edge. And so mass timber has created some phenomenal buildings. We've developed some ourselves at Saris Regis for office, not yet for residential. So it's a technology to watch. It's something that we think will be more prevalent in the future. but it's not, it's not a silver bullet that's going to all of a sudden make everything happen.
And there's
Just-
sorry.
Just to go along those lines, I mean, you probably heard of modular construction. Why not build it in a factory? Ship it over on a train or on a back of a semi, stack it up. Wish it were that easy, at least in San Francisco. We're a very pro-union, pro-prevailing wage type of city. And this takes a lot of labor out of it that is union protected. So we've had issues with that. It makes sense on paper, but just like Drew says, we are innovation technology adverse. Whereas in Japan and many other places, modular construction is status quo. We're still not there yet.
Yep. And then your downtown, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do with your downtown. Ask your council members. That is way above our pay grade. But in all seriousness, we were talking to Rena and some others on the staff before tonight, and they were talking about the form-based code that has come into downtown. Because a lot of the news we've given you tonight is pretty sobering. We know that. Believe me, Eric and I joke that we are nonprofits today, not by choice. And the real estate industry, not necessarily your resale home brokers and everybody who's an individual home owner, but the real estate development world, the business of creating new buildings is really in a pinch right now. And the best thing the city can do is you're not going to turn a spigot and all of a sudden see development happen tomorrow morning, but you can turn some dials and set the table for development to happen earlier rather than later. And the form-based code that Santa Clara has in downtown is a great step towards that. And what form-based code means is that you define a box on a particular block or set of blocks, and you say it can be this tall and it can be this wide, and it has to be set back from trees and single-family homes and other things. But that box can be an office building or a residential building or a retail building, as long as a plan area has a certain amount of office, a certain amount of housing, a certain amount of retail. And what that does is it's a very trusting move of a city to do that, to say, we're really going to let the market come to us and help inform what the downtown or what that specific plan area is going to become. And there are great success stories in the Bay Area. Everybody has individual opinions about certain buildings or downtowns, but there are other downtowns that I'm happy to talk about, maybe afterwards in the reception, where cities did exactly what Santa Clara is doing, but they did it 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. And then the growth came to them at the right time. So leave you with a little bit of optimism, I hope.
And I want to add another comment on downtowns, because we work in a lot of them, and it's something that you really want to have, and it's really tough to pull off, as Drew knows from the slide he talked about costs, which is that you want a retail-friendly, walkable downtown, right, with a lot of activity on the ground floor. And at the same time, for a developer to produce that, it costs a lot of money to put parking underground, right? If you put parking at grade, you have to line the building. So if you want retail on the outside, right, you can maybe put the parking on the inside. That requires a big lot. It is much more expensive whenever you structure something within a residential building, because you have to meet the health and safety and fire codes that are related to that building as you're producing this parking. And when the parking is enclosed and doesn't breathe to the outside, it's going to be much more expensive. In addition, that retail on the ground floor has to be well designed, and there has to be sufficient anchors and sufficient foot traffic, as Drew was saying, to create the activity. So typically what's happening these days is, because retail is so difficult to do, a lot of banks and investors, they don't underwrite the retail as making any money. In fact, they write down the retail, because for the retail, you have to provide retail parking spaces that are expensive. To build out the retail is expensive. And to outfit the retail, which is for restaurants or eating establishments, which is really the most viable retail in a lot of markets, is very expensive. So it ends up being a negative on the pro forma. So they're like, well, we're not going to value that retail. So it's difficult for a developer to get financing and to pay for that parking. So one of the things that I've been recommending to a lot of clients that are really interested in downtown redevelopment is to really think strategically about building a parking garage, which I know is like creating more parking, and there's going to be a quick reaction, oh, no, we don't want to do that. But having a shared parking solution of a public parking garage that people can go in and out of and provide parking in a standalone structure that is open to the air is much more cost effective and a much more better use of land. And ultimately, you could redevelop that piece of property if it is a public parking structure. So I would say that's something to consider, even though I know it might not be the preferred land use on some of your public property, but it's something to just think about, because it makes it actually easier for the developers to do the mixed-use development when they don't have to provide the parking for the retail on top of everything else.
Thanks, Libby. And we're going to take a break, and then we'll be back to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, time for Q&A. As we said before, we'll have a period where the city council members can ask questions, starting facilitated by the mayor. And then we will go through the questions that have been written on the cards. And so if you have a question, I know we're collecting them, just raise your hand. Staff will walk around and grab them. Out of all of the staff introductions, I wanted to make sure we do one. Is Afsha in the room, or did she just step out? I think she just stepped out. Okay. When she gets back here, we will point out our new community development director, Afsha Hamid. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to the mayor for Q&A.
Testing. Okay. All right, so we're going to start with one round of questions from each council member if they have a question, and then we'll get those questions answered, and then we're going to look at the questions that were written on the white sheet. So if anybody has any, Rena up here is going to be collecting them if you think of an additional question you'd like to ask. So we're going to start with our council members. Councilmember Kevin Park, do you have a question?
Well, I did.
Here, you can hold it.
Yes. I had some questions about, you said there was an event in April and also the presentation. I believe the presentation will be available. I just want, to know if you can clarify those things and maybe tell us where we can find out more about the event.
Thank you. Karen Hardy. When you showed all the different places in the United States, I realized that we are competing against that. But I also want to know if someone makes the decision to develop here in this area, how does Santa Clara compare against San Jose, Sunnyvale, Cupertino, Mountain View? Because we are in competition, and we know that. We know our power rates are better, but I would like to know from a development point of view, because they're not going to be looking at so much the operating. They want to know that return on investment. So I'd like to know how we're comparing, especially maybe the time frame. Thank you.
So Santa Clara has a jobs to housing ratio of like 2.9 versus I think San Jose has 0.9. How does that affect the desirability of building housing in a certain city?
Raj Chahal, council member. My question is a little bit more on economic side, keeping in view the long-term effects where we are right now. Like we are hearing a lot about tariffs, interest rate not coming down. So what do you see? I know that one of the topic was uncertainty. So what do you see in this current economic environment? Uncertainty is impacting cities like Santa Clara or states like California. Thank you.
So I'm wondering if you guys could speculate a little bit about small business trends and what you see changing in that, because we're such a small business focused community and our downtown will really depend on that. I'd like to, I know it's a projection, but when we look at what's happening with our mall, Valley Fair, we tend to be flipping the statistics on their head. And I think alluded to, coffee, things like, food are working right now. So I would love to know if we were to move forward in a small business capacity with our downtown. If I look at the Irvine development, Santa Clara Square, 100% occupancy, it's doing beautifully. How do we replicate that and make that uncertainty? If we are going to develop a small business focused downtown, what would a suggestion be?
So I have a question about parking. So we have approved many multifamily developments and asked the developers, or at least allow them to provide less parking than normally we would have provided in the past. Once the units are built, and typically there is a parking shortage, and that causes impacts and problems in the neighborhoods. What is the solution for that? And at what point in time do you see the trends changing? Maybe better public transportation, people not owning cars. We're sort of in that little matrix time where people still have cars and they use them to get around, but we are allowing less parking. And I know parking's expensive, so the developers don't want to build the parking, but the final effects really affect the quality of life in our city. So what do you see? When is that going to change for us? What are your projections on that? So those are our council questions for now. Oh, I didn't see you, Albert. Oh, he's
The oatmeal raisin cookies are great.
He doesn't have a question, so there you go.
How do we want to attack them?
Let's do Housing the Bay first.
Well, the slides, Rena would know better than we would. Where's Rena?
Yes.
Are the slides going to be made available to the council members? Yes. To the public and to the public. So the slides will be available, and the April date, I'm not familiar.
It's April 29th, which is, I believe, a Tuesday. It's from 12:30 to 5 o'clock in San Francisco at the Embarcadero Hyatt. And you can find out about this program and anything you want about ULI on uli.org, or if you Google ULI San Francisco, it will take you to the San Francisco part of the uli.org website. So you can find out, and you can just Google ULI Housing the Bay, San Francisco, and the summit will pop right up.
The other thing we failed to mention earlier, just like Santa Clara is getting a Super Bowl, we have our Super Bowl. ULI has a spring and fall meeting. The fall meeting is a national meeting that's the biggest one of the year, and it happens to be in San Francisco in 2025. So people from all over the country and a few from all over the globe will be descending on San Francisco. And because it is the technology, the center of the universe, it's going to be in early November. It had a different date, and then a company called Salesforce decided that they were going to, in fact, have their big thing in San Francisco again, and so they hip checked us out of Moscone Center. And so ULI's fall meeting is in early November in San Francisco, if anybody's interested as well.
I'll start with one of the questions, because this is something that is not really real estate finance and investment related. It's about the small business trends, which I know almost nothing about, but I want to answer. Because
consider the source.
Yeah. We have been talking a lot about revitalizing downtown. San Francisco's Westfield Mall is pretty much shutting down. It used to be one of the most high revenue producing malls in Westfield's entire portfolio. I'm working with Japantown, San Francisco, and about trying to reimagine their Japantown. And Brookfield has a major development at the Stonestown Mall in San Francisco. So we've been looking at it like, why has Westfield failed, but Japantown Mall is doing better now than it has ever done? And the Stonestown Mall is doing great, whereas Westfield is failing. And it's what you were saying earlier. It's, at least in San Francisco, the malls have repurposed themselves as places of entertainment. You eat and drink first, and then you shop second. And so the draw is a place of entertainment. This is nothing new. If you go to many places in, Japan, Hong Kong, China, malls are built into these multi-story, entertainment complexes, nightclub, restaurant, bar, shopping. So I think, again, taking maybe from Taiwan or something, you always like to say maybe a night market or any other type of activities that generate entertainment. It seems to be working for the malls that are doing well, the retail that's doing well, versus the ones that are not, at least in our study areas in San Francisco.
Well, and the other thing that Eric, I think, is spot on is, and it's very difficult for suburban towns to think of in their downtown, but intensity, rather than density just for density's sake, but intensity is what makes retail thrive. And I learned a long time ago, one of the kind of stalwarts of the industry said, early in my career, I was looking at retail, and somebody told me there's two kinds of retail centers. There's those with parking problems, and there's those that don't have parking problems. And if you are a retailer or an investor or a landlord, you want the parking problems, because that means you've got more people that are trying to shop at your establishments than you can handle. And I don't shop at Westfield Valley Fair all the time, but when I do, I think you have a parking problem, and that's a good thing. Meaning there's just a ton of activity there. So as you think about your downtown, it may be very difficult to admit that bringing intensity to your downtown is probably something that would make it more successful for the small business owners. It comes with a whole bunch of other headaches, but again, that's why the elected officials are here to make those policy decisions of what is for the public benefit.
What is that line? That bar is terrible. It's so crowded you can't get in.
Yeah. All right. Looking at some of the other questions. One of the tougher ones, tariffs and uncertainty. I mean, I would love to talk to the person in this room who knows what is going to happen in Washington, D.C. tomorrow. Forget about, next week or next month or next year. Regardless of who you voted for or where your politics are, I think uncertainty is a reality for now. My father-in-law was a stockbroker, and his adage was, markets don't care about good news or bad news. They can't react when there's no news or when there's uncertain news. So if, in fact, tariffs on all the steel and aluminum coming into the U.S. is just a bluff, then talk to me in a week or a month and we'll see where we are then. If it's real and all the steel and aluminum is going to get a 25% tariff that's coming from outside the U.S., construction costs and the cost of goods of automobiles and a whole bunch of other things are going to go way up. And, what does that mean for real estate development? It's probably not good. So the uncertainty in general is just very, very difficult for, one of the things also that's difficult to understand about real estate and investment is that although we may look at a 10-year or 30-year horizon for investment, it's just human nature that we make decisions based on the information that we just heard 5 minutes ago, right? So a lot of our investors are crunching data from the last 5 days or 5 weeks or 5 months, and that's what they're using to project forward. And so if the last 5 months are, roller coaster graphs, then it makes it very difficult to make decisions.
Can I just add to that, which is for a lot of residential construction, there's a large amount of wood. In addition to mass timber, just the regular, podium construction and then wood frame on top of it is pretty typical. Or if you're doing townhome development, some kind of infill development, there's a good amount of wood. We get a lot of wood from Canada. We don't get all our wood from Canada. But we have had challenges with supplies because of the fires, and the tariffs that are being talked about, from what I'm understanding, and you should check this on any source you want, but I was doing some research on this, they're additive. So whereas right now we have about a 14% tariff on wood, these tariffs would be additive to that, at least what's being proposed. So if your wood prices were to go up 35% for a lot of housing development, that would really drive construction costs higher. There's still a lot of steel and concrete and cement, don't get me wrong, and aluminum in these products, but there's a lot of supply that is built from wood, so that's a big issue.
All right, can we tackle the parking question, the mayor's question about parking? Because this is one where I'm very hopeful about technology. We were silly enough about 15 years ago to put parking stackers into a small condominium project in San Jose, and it was an unmitigated disaster. And the big reason it is because we had individual homeowners and the HOA that had to figure out how to deal with the stackers if something went wrong. You put stackers in apartments and they can work beautifully because you have an institutional investor, you have on-site property management 24 hours a day. If something goes wrong with the stackers, you have maintenance people, you have a procedure to follow, and you can respond accordingly. We've seen some whiz-bang solutions now where think about a valet who's jamming as many cars as they can into a lot. So the cars are no longer parking in a traditional kind of parking garage format, but they're all piled in together. There's now a system out there where a little robot under a trolley goes under your car, picks the car up just high enough so that your tires aren't touching the ground, and then it can move the car in any direction. And so it's kind of like a virtual valet. So I don't know if that's going to be the one that solves it, but there are, the first question is how many spaces do you have to build? Developers don't dictate the market. The residents of an apartment community or the occupants of an office building dictate how many spaces are needed. And if a developer is doing their job, they're responding to the market. If they have a parking problem, it's because they misjudge that. And if their residents are overrunning the parking on site, then the original intent was not met. But I do think there are technology-based solutions which can allow retrofits of existing problems and will allow much more efficient solutions of new problems. So that's my parking answer.
I like it.
So we've got jobs, housing in Santa Clara, and who is our favorite child?
I mean, Libby, you want to talk jobs, housing? That's a major stat that we all look at.
Yeah, I mean, employment is very important because people have to live. Again, we have more and more hybrid work or more and more remote work, but having a job center economy is very important for residential demand, so it's a good thing. On the other hand, it does create challenges that we were talking about in terms of who's competing to buy the land for housing and who's competing to develop the land for something else other than housing. So it can be hard to dig your way out of a high jobs housing ratio. So I think that from a long-term perspective, because we haven't had enough housing production, we Bay Area wide are intensifying the imbalance between jobs and housing that's occurring. And that's a challenge. And there was a slide that we didn't talk about a lot, but our net migration trends are improving. I know there was a lot of news media about everybody's leaving California, everybody's leaving Silicon Valley, but we are actually now in the Bay Area having a net migration positive. So that is putting more demand on housing. So we just have to figure out this equation to try to get more housing produced.
Yeah, I will add, used to be jobs housing was one of the strongest metrics you looked at. There's 4 jobs to every 1 unit of housing available, and these are drivers. After the pandemic, it became a little bit of a head scratcher. People weren't coming to work, at least for what I focused on. Did a lot of projects in Oakland and San Francisco, urban cores, where people lived, played, and worked within 3 miles of every building they would be in. So it supported building high-density housing. but then people left. So I believe the return to work is happening. I think as long as that is getting back to normal, the jobs housing ratio will again start to mean more of what it used to. It meant less when people weren't living near their work anymore.
And then the last question about our favorite city. We spent a lot of time preparing for tonight, and we're going to be here till at least 9 o'clock tonight, so we don't do that for our cities that we don't love. But I would answer the question this way. Santa Clara is very well regarded, amongst the business community as a well-run city. The example I would give, or the wish list I would ask for, is if I'm a developer looking at a piece of land and I'm thinking about building something in Santa Clara, if I walk into the planning department, economic development, housing, planning commissioners, public works, city council, it's like parenting. If I get a consistent answer from each of those different groups, that to me is a well-run city. There was a city that will remain nameless in the Bay Area that many years ago, countless developers would go to planning commission and just get crushed. I mean, run out of the room, barely any votes. And people are like, why are you doing this? And he said, oh, because in that city council is all that matters. The city council and the planning commission in that city were on two different planets, but the city council was the only one that mattered. So developers would literally go through a multi-year process getting direction from planning commissioners and just completely disregarding it. And it was a total waste of time, and everybody kind of knew the game. And that would be my example of a city that was not well run at the time. So if everybody up and down City Hall gives you a consistent answer as a developer, that's a great city to work in. And I think Santa Clara has that reputation.
I have not developed in Santa Clara because it's high demand. I can't compete with all the South Bay developers, so I stick to my little geography. But I would love to come down here.
Well, and I think you are also asking about sort of competition for money. And there's still a big interest in Silicon Valley and investment in Silicon Valley. And you are ground zero for so many of the technology companies that people are really watching and looking at. So I think that differentiates you a lot as a city. And I think that, increasingly, people are looking at, the walkability and the walk scores and the bike scores. And I know you've been doing a lot of investment on that. As a city, you also have great parks. So those are all the kind of public investments that are really important that a city can make to make it more attractive for development and for people to live here and to work here and to play here.
So
Is that it for the questions?
I think
so.
unless
I took
any of the
notes.
council members felt like we didn't get your question answered, we took notes, we tried to hit them all.
I think you really did. Thank you so much. And as a reminder, our city just passed a $400 million infrastructure bond. So there's going to be a lot more investment in the city as well. So I think now that our Director of Economic Development, Rena, has the cards or the questions, or Javon, somebody is going to take the questions from the audience.
Yes, absolutely. It will be Rena, our Director of Economic Development. But I do want to take this moment to introduce Afsha Hamid, our new Community Development Director, who is absolutely wonderful. So, we are lucky to have her, and say hi.
Thank you. We have approximately 10 to 15 questions here from the audience. And looking at them, you would think that maybe the audience was comprised of maybe some sophisticated people who've been around development. So just a heads up. And a wide range of questions here. So how do you address impact fees in an economic environment like today? And there's a follow-up question, which is a little more specific, but I'm going to say it now because I think that was the intent, which is there a step up or elevator approach to recover after the economy is better? And I think that is somewhat tied to fees, requirements, benefits, all of that.
So, I'm on what is called a Technical Advisory Committee, San Francisco, to think about the biggest impact, which is the amount of affordable housing. As Drew pointed out earlier, one of the costs is the affordable housing, inclusionary housing you need to have in your project. It's a big drag on money's return on investment. So we try to, every 3 years, revisit it. Say, should it be 20%? Should it be 12%? Should it be 15%? I think the question, I spoke with the person who asked the question, that is the, everyone wants to do this. How can we tie community benefit? How can we tie the needs of a city with the market? So when the market goes up and the developers making more money, we can get more benefits. And when it goes down, we can reduce our benefits, hand in hand. And so we continue to stimulate development. Here's the answer. You can't. It's just government and the markets don't work hand in hand. What I recommend is doing the best you can, but being proactive to still try to work with developers, private citizens, and public, kind of like what we're trying to do in San Francisco, to try to ratchet it up and down as best as you can, but make sure that whatever relaxation of fees or relaxation of inclusionary, there's a sunset period and reevaluate, then as it goes up. But what it does is, if you set it for 3-year periods, we do it for 3-year periods, as Drew said, you create certainty. You have to create some certainty. You can't change it. That's the thing, right? You can't change it willy-nilly, or no one's going to ever invest your city.
So one of the things that's really important, and a lot of cities are going to have to do this, is to do a comprehensive review of your development impact fees. And a few things to look at is, one, as land values increase, a lot of times park fees, because you're trying to acquire more land for parks, then that dramatically increases park fees. Some jurisdictions that I know of that are actually in the Silicon Valley area, because land prices have increased so much, their park fees can run $100,000 a door. That's more than Drew can afford to pay for land at zero, and definitely a lot more than $50,000. So a few strategies to think about with fees is looking at fees on a per residential square foot basis, which you may do with some of your fees, but really looking at all of your fees that way. There's also a piece of the law that a lot of cities don't know about with impact fees, which is that you actually need to look at transit accessible development with a different, your transportation fees taking into account transit-friendly development. So it's really important to look at your transportation fees in relationship. Some cities are actually moving that forward so that if it's a transit-friendly development, that it may have a reduction in fees generally. The other thing that's happened recently with state law is to allow developers to pay fees later. That isn't good for your public infrastructure investment, so I understand that. But by allowing fees to be paid later in the process, at this point at certificate of occupancy versus a building permit stage, as we talked about, it's usually in housing about a 2-year construction period, and the developer has to finance that. They have to basically raise the money, the equity or the construction financing to pay for those fees. So by moving it to the certificate of occupancy time period, it's a lot less risk for the investors, and it's a lot less cost if you're borrowing money. So those are some strategies that can really be helpful for thinking about your fees in the future.
Great, thank you. This card has a few questions, so I'm going to tackle one of them and then come back to the card in case anyone is an author here.
Is this 2, A, B, and C, or
No.
2, 3, and 4?
No, 3 different questions that will be asked at 3 different times. The first is, what about property insurance? It's becoming harder to secure insurance, or it's super expensive. Real estate and insurance go hand in hand. Is there anything that can be done at the local level?
Boy, I mean, you have to know with what's happened in LA with the fires right now, nobody knows where insurance is going, but it's not going down, right? I mean, some estimates are that the state program that backstops houses that can't get traditional insurance, has $700 million in the bank, and there's $4, $5, or $6 billion worth of houses estimated in the LA area that were decimated. And we are all going to pay for that because the insurance companies that do provide everyday insurance have the right to bump their premium because their coffers are going to get rated, and then they have the right to come back and charge everybody else higher premiums to make up for it. So insurance is one of the most difficult things in our industry. For multifamily specifically, we used to underwrite not that many years ago somewhere between $600 to $1,000 per unit for general property insurance, and some investors demand earthquake insurance and some don't, and some want lower deductibles, some not. But that $600 to $1,000 was the general range. Today, those numbers are like $2,500 a unit or $3,000 a unit, just 5 years later. So insurance is a huge uncertainty. It's very difficult to project. Some companies are like public REITs, where they go to the public markets to raise money and then own big pools of assets. They self-insure. Some investors have what's called captive insurance companies, which are effectively large private vehicles to self-insure. But for institutional real estate, those are the kinds of things people are trying to do to tackle that problem. For individual homeowners, I don't know if that was the question. I wish I had an answer, but nobody knows.
And also the insurance on new construction has also increased a lot as well. So it's getting priced into those fixed costs at a higher rate.
Yep.
And I think that, I don't know what you can do other than as a public agency to help with thinking about, again, I know the building requirements that are being put on developments are making it, they're much more rigorous than they were before, for example, on fire safety and all of that. So I think that largely a lot of cities have been incorporating policies that will hopefully have an impact on keeping the insurance premiums at least, not going crazy other than the market that's been talked about.
Great. This member of the audience had 2 questions/comments, actually. The first was related to payment of fees at C of O, which, thank you, I think this team talked about. The point being is paying earlier, you are then paying interest on the impact fee, which can equate to millions of dollars. Their second question is on the topic of right-sizing city fees. Specifically, they are focused on the parks fees being calculated at 2.4 persons per unit for multifamily. They feel that in reality, it is a 1.6 per unit. So the comment is that they believe they're paying 50% more than they should. So it's a comment, but anything that you can elaborate on calculation of fees or parks fees or anything that you have thoughts on.
Well, the cities do have the ability to move that calculation. That some cities in the Bay Area, there are standards of how you calculate people per unit, but the calculations are somewhat antiquated in that they don't really address single family versus townhome versus condominiums or apartments. And I agree. Generally, the statistics show that you'll have more people per single-family home than per apartment. So the city, I do believe, has some ability to move that lever. And then the second one is how many acres of land per person. Some cities, I think Los Altos, has a goal of 5 acres per person, and others have 3 acres per person. And so, yes, everybody wants parks and open space. But parks can be a lot of things. They can be hardscape plazas. They can be, redwood forests. So you can adjust the way you calculate per unit. You can adjust how many acres per person the city's goal is, and you can adjust the definition of park space.
Yeah, and I'll give you a couple of ideas from past projects we've worked on that builds on what Drew just said, which is it's very tricky to get the data on this. So your impact fee consultant is going to have a challenging time with this. But But sizing multifamily fees in relationship to the bedroom distribution. So in other words, studios and one bedrooms are going to have smaller households, right, than 2 and 3 bedrooms. So there's going to be a mix of units. And so tying potentially the fee not just per unit, but tied to the bedroom mix is something to consider. The other thing that we did in the eastern neighborhoods that I think Eric's familiar with is that in San Francisco, there's a large area on the eastern side of the city that the city really wanted to intensify development in. Very little land was available. And we're blessed in the city of San Francisco, as you are in Santa Clara, of having a lot of large city parks and large-scale parks. But what we recognized was really needed to create this neighborhood in the eastern neighborhoods is small neighborhood parks. So the requirements were sized for a 1-acre park per threshold. So instead of 5 acres per 1,000, it's 1 acre per 1,000. And then there was a commitment on the part of the city to intensify the utilization of other parks within the city to accommodate more people to use those parks. So in other words, not have to buy land, but to intensify how those parks are used and to enable the demand increase from population to occur at those larger parks without having to acquire more land. So it's a potential strategy to consider.
I would add, historically, everything Libby's saying is true. We looked at fees to pay for the impact of when you're building new housing, whether it goes to schools, parks, whatever. I would suggest that we should start looking more at sizing the fees to allow housing to be built instead of just looking at the impact. There's no reason, or these metrics are created, but if you have a policy of building housing first, look more like what I said earlier. How can we be as a partner, as a city, to size our fees to put it at the right amount to encourage feasibility for housing? And then as you can keep adjusting it. So it's not just the impact, but also as a partner to size it to allow for more housing production.
Great, thanks. So the next question, there is a perception that higher density means greater land value. Can you talk about your experience with density and land value? And is that a policy lever the city can use to encourage developments?
Yes, I can talk about it. Higher density does not always mean higher land value. And the difficult part for cities to plan on is that the time it takes the market to react is much, much faster than the time that a city and a general plan and a zoning process can possibly react. We have a very easy example. We built a very successful apartment project in downtown San Jose in 2013-14. And at the time, Sam Liccardo was the mayor and he was pushing for high-rise housing. We bought a high-rise site and we built a wood-framed apartment building. And Sam, was pushing us the whole time, why can't you do high-rise? And we said, the economics don't work for high-rise, but they work for this. If you want, is some housing better than no housing? Was kind of the question we posed, and ultimately it was. We had another example recently. There are many, many entitled projects, as some of the questions alluded to earlier, that aren't going forward. And there was a 100-unit condominium deal, and our investor looked at it and said, I would pay more for the land if it was a smaller project. And in that particular case, it's one building with 100 units. And unlike apartments where you typically absorb, which means you typically rent 20, 25, or 30 apartments a month when you're in a lease up, if you're selling condominiums, it's very common to sell 3 or 4 or 5 a month. So if you have 100 units, that's 25 months at 4 a month. That's over 2 years. And you have to have the entire building completed, parking garage, all the exterior on, all the windows in, all the life safety systems working just to occupy the very first unit. So when you sell that first unit, the developer has 99 units of standing inventory. And there's no way, unlike a big housing subdivision, there's no way to phase that. You have to pay for all 100 units on day one and then sell them very slowly. So absolutely, density does not always mean more land value. There are times that it does. which is why it's so difficult for cities to react.
And to Drew's example earlier, if I were to build a multifamily right now, high rise is probably $600,000 a unit. We have concrete is expensive, and you probably have to use a union labor shop to do concrete. But if I had to do 3-story walk-up townhomes, there's so many more contractors out there, non-union, that you can use to just build ground up, no excavation, probably $250,000 a unit, less than half the cost. So that will make your residual land value be more valuable per unit. So it's, again, density doesn't always translate to land value increase.
Did that answer all the parts of that one?
Yes. Yes. Okay, looking into your crystal ball, what is the office multifamily market like in 5 years?
Great. We're developers.
Okay. Better than today.
Better than today.
So we certainly believe, you know, a lot of people have asked about Santa Clara specifically, what can we do? One of the realities is we are in California, and there are many, many investors across the country that had redlined California for investment in the last few years. And a lot of it was because of the talks of rent control. I don't know how many of you may have paid attention, but in the last election cycle, there is a gentleman in LA who has nothing to do with real estate in his day-to-day business, but he has put ballot measures on the ballot each of the last 3 election cycles, so every 2 years for the last 3 cycles, and he's been defeated every time, but he's vowed to keep doing it. If the ballot measure had not been defeated, it would have completely changed investors' appetite to invest in California, hard stop. We would have had zero money coming to California to build rental housing. And so there's a perception that California is a risky state to invest in, not because you won't always fill an apartment complex, but because the political environment tends to be very progressive. And just like we've seen the pendulum swing in places like San Francisco and LA, where some policies make for, you know, untenable, you know, street scenes in big cities, and now the pendulum starts to swing in the other direction. A lot of the housing policy stuff may be sending the pendulum back towards the middle, which investors see as a very positive thing. So I do think that there's a lack of supply coming in for the next couple of years. I do think that there will be a lot more investment in housing in California, maybe not tomorrow, but in 2026 and 27, which means in 5 years, knock wood, we'll be back to a more normalized market. Who wants to speak to office?
Well, I'm going to say a little bit about office in that if you look at tiers in office, so there's Class A, Class B, Class C. So Class A is the newer construction, new development. We've been focusing mostly on new development. Class B is older development, but not as old as Class C. Class B development and Class C development of office are tending, particularly in cities like San Francisco, and to looking at some of the data here in Santa Clara, there where the higher vacancies are occurring. There is a preference among a lot of tenants and corporations to be in newer buildings. There's preferences of employees to be in these newer buildings. So Class A buildings, just to give you an example, and I'm looking at Jay to make sure I say the right thing. In San Francisco, Class A office vacancy is around 15% for the newer buildings, whereas the overall vacancy is closer to 30-35%, right? So that's just an illustration in our city of San Francisco. That is true in a lot of the markets in the Bay Area. So there is a redevelopment potential for these older office buildings. Some of them are just not going to make it. If you have a Class B office building that is suitable for renovation and suitable for upgrade so that you can keep with the market, it will start to perform better. I think the Class C buildings are going to have a harder and harder time, the aging buildings. So I think you'll see opportunities for change there. I mean, that's my long-term crystal ball. That's not like tomorrow crystal ball, but I think that that's an important opportunity. And that also gives you some opportunity to have some office to housing conversions potentially to occur in the future that could occur. However, back to the land residual, you have to be able to pay enough to tear down a building, right? To build new. If you can convert a Class B building, which is what we're hoping will happen in some of the San Francisco buildings, but the market hasn't recovered enough that you can pay the cost of renovation yet, but we're hopeful, and maybe there'll be some incentives to do that Class B office space to residential conversion.
San Francisco made a Faustian deal with tech. They said, come tech, do your big towers. We're going to tax you based on the number of people that come to your office. That was a very bad thing to have after COVID. So I don't know if other cities have done that, where they penalized offices with very burdensome taxes based on the gross revenue and the number of employees like San Francisco has. So San Francisco is trying very hard to change all that. They're no longer going to tax you based on the number of people that you come to your office. I do think office will come back. 2 reasons. One, they're going to reset the values. Once you reset the values, you can charge less rent, and then people who left the offices will come back, because I think downtowns can be vibrant and people want to work and live in that. And secondly, I think the tax regimes are being changed now to not penalize downtown offices for having their employees there.
Thank you. It's not that cloudy of a crystal ball after all. Okay, so new for sale housing is rare. How much does the 10-year construction defect law in California influence this? And what can cities do to encourage more for sale housing, specifically condos? And I think I can just add on to that. We do get a fair amount of interest in townhomes. So I think this is for sale housing in a different kind of product type with more density.
Yeah, we do all types, and you're not the first city to ask how can we get more condo development, because the reality is housing is so expensive in our areas that condominiums are often that is the first time home that a lot of people can attain. The 10-year liability is real. It's not going away. It's, again, something that every builder has to insure around or treat in some way. We as a private builder pretty much assume that we're going to get sued on every project, no matter how well we think we build a building. It's just the industry is built so that 9.5 years into an HOA, there is a cottage industry of attorneys that track that, and they will send all the homeowners letters and kick up dust. And often they work on contingency, so the homeowners don't really have a risk, and that's why the lawsuits come. It's just a cost of doing business in California. So I don't know that Santa Clara can do anything to magically change that. The tough part about what can the city do is condominiums. When you look at housing production, whether it's single-family homes, which almost, single-family homes in large quantities very rarely get built in places like Santa Clara anymore, but townhomes are kind of the equivalent now. Public home builders, which have very low cost of capital, they're very, very good at building the houses. They're very efficient at buying the widgets that go into the house. But public home builders are effectively mobile factories, right? They are equipped. Some of them entitle, but really they're not equipped to entitle. They're equipped to build the house and sell the house. And they do that very, very well. And they're best at it when the house is repeatable. Condominiums are not that. So condominiums are left, really, it's one of the few competitive advantages that we have as a private builder is that we feel like we can take on, we call them little Swiss watch projects that are, everyone is bespoke, everyone is different, and everyone is difficult. But that's a place that we can succeed, quite frankly, because the public builders pass them over. They're not equipped to build those kinds of buildings. So, all the things we talked about of adding certainty, is about the only thing a city can do. The market needs to respond, and the market needs to be able to service the residents that need those homes. That's really as simple as it can be stated.
And there have been moves at the state level for there to be a reduction in the time frame for the 10-year liability, to reduce the time frame, which has been talked about a lot to really help with housing production. So I think it's worth tracking that legislation, trying to support it. I know this year that the legislators have to really prioritize what legislation they can bring forward. So it's something to think about as you're talking with your electeds.
All right, question number 8, if we're keeping track.
Did I say 10 questions? I think there's a little more than that. Okay, how do you anticipate Elon Musk's portable houses impacting Santa Clara's real estate market? Do you expect them to influence housing demand, pricing, or development trends in the area, knowing that they're running for as low as $10,000? And a side note, thank you for this informative presentation. I learned a lot.
This is one where I can honestly say I have no idea. I really don't.
So modular houses, what do you call it? Container houses, ones made out of like shipping containers. They've been talked about. It's no different. It's not going to change. You just can't throw a container or a modular house on a piece of land. You still have power, sewage, infrastructure, and you got to stack it. You have ADA, accessibility requirements. You have Title 24 energy requirements, especially in California. There's a host of technical requirements plus physical and practical requirements to have a home. So I don't know. I don't think it's going to make any difference.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big supporter of it, and I would like to see it make more of a difference. The challenge with modular 2, adding on to what Eric said, is that you have to be able to stage it. So there needs to be a place where you can keep these modular units. So, and it needs to be within close proximity to where you're building, preferably next door, which means for an infill site, it's really difficult to accomplish. And also, they have to be wrapped so that they can withstand the weather, right? And that's really important. And they have to be transported. So all of those things add to the risk and cost. I'm very, there's one of my favorite entrepreneurs who unfortunately wasn't able to take the product to market, was actually working with the Carpenters Union on technology that would actually have worked in a more, not in a modular box, but in modular components that would have allowed a broader range of people to install them and to make it more cost effective, which he was doing in collaboration with the union. The challenge is that as soon as you hit a market blip, you know, if you don't have production for a number of years, then you can't support the factory or support whatever the infrastructure is. So because real estate is so cyclical, it's just been really hard to get those technology advances to go forward without some kind of committed revenue stream. So if I were like the queen of the state of California, I would be like saying, okay, we're going to guarantee production of 10,000 units a year or 50,000 units a year so that we can ramp up these factories so that they would actually be able to produce. But we just never have that kind of public commitment. And so therefore, they're very dependent on the market. And you've just seen so many of these companies crash and burn.
I mean, what Elon Musk should be doing is his genius was getting all kinds of government, federal tax subsidies and incentives for production of electric cars, and also additional subsidies and benefits for people who bought them. That was the real genius in my mind. And then he went to China and did it again there, getting all kinds of, if he can figure out how to get the right way, again, let's say instead of T-bills, people are getting 4% return, and that's the market for workforce housing, something we all need. It's just a recalibration of the market and how people deploy capital, like what he did for electric cars. That will make a big difference, much more than modular housing. That's what we need to do, recalibrate how we deploy capital.
Right. Just 2 more questions, and I think they're going to be really fast. Are transfer taxes due upon sales and refinancing, or just sale?
Upon sale or any change of ownership. So if you refinance and 50% or more of the partnerships or ownerships change, there's a transfer tax. So It's anytime there's a change of ownership.
Great. This is a comment, but would like you to elaborate on the thoughts. So related to the ideas, the creative ideas to help make an area or district more attractive and thus more financeable are things like public projects using available impact fees already collected to be utilized for things like parking and parks. Are ideas like joint marketing to help retail districts, also good. And are things like phasing or selective TCOs things to encourage? So those were creative ideas. Once again, it's about maybe leveraging impact fees for public goods, ideas around joint marketing to help retail districts, and then phasing or selective TCOs to help projects along. Any ideas, any thoughts on those ideas?
Yeah, so I would say the phasing of TCOs can definitely be helpful, just like paying impact fees later in a project. You know, the use of public funds can be a tricky one because it can trigger prevailing wage, which can be a more expensive way to build a building than not. But I'll give you an example. We built a project in a city 15 years ago in the Bay Area where it was right when Jerry Brown was eliminating redevelopment agencies. And there was a threat that every city had an account filled with housing funds. And I can't remember exactly how it went, but the governor's office said if the cities haven't used those housing funds, Sacramento's going to take them all. And so we had a project where we had a choice to take city funds to subsidize some of the affordability within the project. And if we took the subsidy, it would trigger prevailing wage. So I'll just make up the numbers, but what would an apartment project that would cost us $100 million to build we might get a subsidy from the city, but now it's going to cost us $120 million to build it. And instead, we said to the city, hey, let's get creative. How about we build that project for $100 million, and after it's built, you, the city, quote unquote, buy down the affordability with subsidy. So now the structure is already created. There is no further construction, so the prevailing wage issue doesn't come into play. And this is all above board. It's all in the public realm, and we did that. And it was also elegant because the city was able to earmark those funds, and then they could say to the governor's office, those funds are committed. You can't steal them. Or excuse me, take them. And so it was kind of an everybody wins, but it took a very creative, city kind of management, attorney, finance staff to say, yeah, this is something we can do, and everybody wins if we do it. But it wasn't the normal way to do it at the time.
Yeah, that's all
10.
our questions.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we adjourn, I just want to thank Drew, Libby, and Eric for an amazing presentation. I don't think we could have picked better people. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I also want to take a moment to thank Rena, Alicia Knight. I was coming back to her. But also David Knight in our communications department for really putting this on. It was late last year that I said, hey, let's have a symposium type event. I think ULI does this. And they didn't look at me crazy and say, do you know what's on our workload? They said, absolutely, that'll be a great idea. And so Alicia, Rena, and David did such an amazing job to put on tonight. So just thank you. So with that, I'll turn it over to the mayor to adjourn.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the presentation. I've been in real estate for over 40 years, and I learned a lot tonight, so thank you so much. On behalf of everyone, thank you all for coming. and you're welcome to stay for networking after this event. But out there, I think they're pushing us out the door, so exit quickly. But I'm going to ask my council, may I please have a motion to adjourn? So moved. Is there a second? Motion second to adjourn. All in favor, raise your hand or say aye. Aye. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much for coming.